The first thing she felt was the rope cutting into her wrists. It burned like fire each time she struggled. Dust swirled around her boots as she dug her heels into the ground, trying to slow the men dragging her across the road. The wide prairie stretched empty in every direction, silent except for the rough laughter of the three men hauling her toward the wagon waiting ahead. "You can't do this to me," she cried, her voice shaking but fierce. One of the men twisted her arm harder behind her back. Pain shot through her shoulder and forced her forward. "The law says we can," he said, with a grin that showed crooked yellow teeth. "Now keep moving." Dust rolled across the road like a living thing. The wind pushed it low and heavy along the ground, wrapping around the wagon's wheels and the horses that stamped and snorted impatiently beside it. Emily Carter fought with everything she had left. Her boots scraped against the dry earth. Her shoulders strained against the grip holding her. Her wrists throbbed where the rope dug deeper into her skin. But the three men were stronger and crueler. To them, this was nothing more than a job on a long afternoon. One man held her arm twisted behind her back. Another shoved her forward by the shoulders. The third walked ahead of them, flicking a whip through the air for no reason except to enjoy the sound of it cracking across the quiet road. They laughed as if the whole thing amused them. Emily's cries were swallowed by the wind. The frontier had a way of swallowing voices. The land was too wide, the roads too empty, and justice too far away. Blood ran from the corner of her mouth, where one of them had struck her earlier when she tried to run. Fear pounded through her chest as the wagon came closer. It stood in the middle of the road like a trap waiting to close. The shadow beneath it stretched long across the dirt, dark and cold, like a grave already dug. They shoved her down beside the rear wheel. Emily hit the ground hard, dust filling her mouth. Before she could move, one of the men grabbed the rope and wrapped it tighter around her wrists. Another tied the line around the iron rim of the wagon wheel, pulling it until her arms were forced upward and locked in place. She struggled, but the rope only tightened. To them, she was not a person. She was cargo, something to be hauled down a road and traded for money. The smell of sweat and leather hung heavy in the hot air. Beneath it was something worse, the sour smell of men who had done things like this before and never answered for it. One of the men crouched in front of her. He grabbed her chin and forced her face upward. His breath smelled like cheap whiskey. His smile showed teeth that were dark and broken. "No one's coming for you," he said softly. Emily tried to pull away, but his fingers tightened. "This road's empty," he continued. "Nothing but dust for 50 miles. No sheriff, no travelers, no one who cares enough to stop." He leaned closer. "The world already forgot you." For a terrible moment, Emily believed him. The prairie stretched in every direction like an endless ocean of grass and dirt. The sky above it was wide and empty. The road behind them held no wagons, no riders, no sound except the restless horses tied to the wagon. Then something changed. A faint rhythm reached the road. Hoofbeats. Slow, steady, coming from the far end of the trail. The man holding her chin frowned. He stood and turned toward the sound. Another of the men shaded his eyes and squinted into the distance. The third one laughed. "Relax," he said. "Probably just some drifter passing through. Soon as he sees trouble, he'll keep riding." But the hoofbeats did not slow. They did not turn away. They came closer. Calm, unhurried, like the rider already knew exactly what he would find. Through the rising dust, a figure appeared, a lone cowboy riding toward them. He sat tall in the saddle, moving with the easy balance of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback. His coat was worn but clean. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, so that his expression was hidden. He rode straight toward the wagon, straight toward the men, straight toward Emily. The cowboy stopped his horse a short distance away. For a moment he simply looked. His gaze moved slowly from the wagon to the horses, then to the ropes tied around the wheel. Finally, to Emily sitting in the dirt. There was no surprise in his face, no hesitation, just quiet understanding. His hand rested near the revolver on his belt. Not gripping it, just resting there. One of the men stepped forward and lifted his rifle. "That's far enough," he shouted. "Road's closed today. Ride along." The cowboy said nothing. He nudged his horse forward another step. The man with the rifle raised the weapon higher. "You deaf, cowboy?" Still no answer. Emily watched the stranger closely. Now that he was closer, she could see his face clearly. The sun had carved deep lines into his skin. His jaw was rough with stubble. His eyes were steady and cold in a way that made the air feel heavier. He looked like a man who had seen too much of the world to be surprised by it anymore. Everything happened in one sudden moment. The wagon driver climbed onto the seat and grabbed the reins. "Let's move," he muttered nervously. "I don't like this." The cowboy moved. His hand flashed downward. The gun cleared his holster faster than Emily's eyes could follow. The shot cracked across the empty prairie. Sharp. Final. The driver jerked backward as the bullet struck his chest. He fell from the wagon seat and hit the ground lifeless before the dust even settled. The horses screamed and reared, jerking the wagon sideways. The two remaining men froze in shock. Then they reached for their guns. The cowboy fired again. Another shot tore through the air. The revolver flew from one man's hand, spinning into the dirt. The second shot knocked the rifle from the other man's grip before he could even aim. The two men stared at him, stunned. The third man turned and ran. He ran across the open prairie like a frightened animal, stumbling through the grass without even looking back. The man who lost his rifle dropped to his knees. "Don't shoot!" he cried. "Please!" The cowboy did not chase the runner. He did not answer the begging man. Instead, he holstered his revolver and stepped down from his horse. His boots touched the ground quietly. Emily held her breath as he walked toward her. The man kneeling in the road scrambled away, crawling through the dust before finally staggering to his feet and running after the other. Within seconds, the road was empty again. Only the wagon, the horses, and the cowboy walking toward her with calm steps. He stopped beside the wheel. Without a word, he pulled a knife from his belt. The blade sliced clean through the ropes. Emily's arms dropped suddenly, the pain rushing through them as blood returned to her hands. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out. Before she hit the ground, the cowboy caught her. His grip was strong but careful, holding her upright as if she weighed almost nothing. For the first time since the men had grabbed her hours earlier, Emily felt her chest loosen enough to take a full breath. She expected questions, accusations, something. Instead, the cowboy shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The heavy fabric blocked the wind and dust around them. It felt strangely safe. "You're safe now," he said quietly. His voice was calm and steady, not loud, not dramatic, just certain. He helped her walk away from the wagon and toward the side of the road. Behind them, the prairie wind blew through the empty space where the men had stood moments before. Their power had vanished as quickly as it came. Emily glanced back once. Then she turned forward again toward the man who had refused to look away. That night, they built a small fire beneath a sky filled with stars. The prairie grew quiet again. Emily sat wrapped in his coat, while the flames crackled softly between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, she told him everything. How the men had taken her, where they planned to sell her. What would have happened if he had not come down that road? The cowboy listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stared into the fire for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Evil grows when people stay silent," he said. "It shrinks fast when someone decides not to." He looked up at the dark prairie around them. "I learned that lesson the hard way." Emily said nothing. But as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled slowly above them, she realized something important. She was no longer the helpless woman tied to a wagon wheel. She was alive. And tomorrow she would ride forward beside the one man who had chosen courage instead of silence. Morning arrived slowly over the plains. The darkness faded one thin shade at a time until pale sunlight touched the tops of the distant hills. The prairie looked peaceful again, as if the land itself had already forgotten the violence that had taken place the day before. Emily Carter woke beside the dying embers of the fire. For a moment she did not move. She lay still under the heavy coat wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the quiet wind moving through the grass. Then the memories returned. The ropes, the wagon wheel, the men dragging her across the dirt road. Her breath tightened in her chest. She sat up quickly, her eyes scanning the empty prairie around her. The cowboy stood about 20 steps away. He faced the open land with a rifle resting across his arms, watching the horizon like a man who had learned long ago that danger often returned when people believed it was gone. He noticed her movement, but did not turn around. "You're awake," he said calmly. Emily nodded, though he could not see her. "Yes." Her voice was hoarse from dust and fear. She pushed herself to her feet slowly. Her arms still ached from where the ropes had cut into her skin. The marks around her wrists were dark and swollen. The cowboy finally turned. His eyes moved briefly to the bruises on her arms, then back to her face. "There's water by the saddlebag," he said. Emily walked toward the horse and found the small canteen tied beside the saddle. The water inside was cool and clean. She drank slowly, feeling the dryness in her throat fade with each swallow. When she finished, she looked back at the cowboy. "You never told me your name." He studied the horizon for a moment before answering. "Daniel Hayes." She repeated it quietly. "Daniel." The name felt strong and simple, like the man himself. "And you?" he asked. "Emily Carter." Daniel nodded once. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, while the sun climbed higher into the sky. Finally, Daniel walked toward the horse and began tightening the saddle straps. "There's a town about half a day from here," he said. "Small place called Red Creek." Emily stepped closer. "Are we going there?" "Yes." "Why?" Daniel checked the rifle, leaning against the saddle before answering. "Because men like the ones yesterday don't work alone." Emily felt a chill, despite the growing warmth of the morning. "You think they'll come back?" Daniel swung himself into the saddle. "They already might be." He reached a hand down toward her. "Best we move." Emily hesitated only a second before taking his hand. He pulled her up behind him onto the horse. The animal shifted its weight, but remained calm. The prairie stretched endlessly ahead of them as Daniel guided the horse onto the dirt trail. They rode at a steady pace, not fast, not slow, the kind of careful travel that came from years of knowing the land. As the miles passed, Emily noticed something about the man in front of her. Daniel never stopped watching. His eyes moved constantly across the hills and the distant tree lines. His head turned slightly at every sound the wind carried. His hand never drifted far from the revolver resting at his side. He was not nervous. He was ready. Emily realized then that saving her yesterday had not been some sudden heroic moment. It was simply part of the life he lived. After an hour of riding, she spoke again. "Why did you stop?" Daniel did not look back. "What do you mean?" Yesterday, she said. You could have ridden past. Most people would have. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm on the hard ground. Daniel stayed silent long enough that Emily wondered if he planned to answer at all. Then he spoke. Once, he said quietly, I did ride past. Emily waited. There was a wagon on the road, he continued. A man shouting. A woman crying. His voice stayed calm, but something in it had hardened. I told myself it wasn't my problem. The wind swept across the prairie. What happened? Emily asked softly. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. I buried 3 people the next morning. The words settled heavy between them. Emily did not ask anything else. She understood enough. The prairie rolled by in waves of tall grass and scattered rocks. A hawk circled high in the blue sky above them. By midday, the sun burned hot overhead. Daniel slowed the horse as they reached a narrow stretch of land between 2 low ridges. He studied the ground carefully. Then he pulled the horse to a stop. What is it? Emily asked. Daniel slid down from the saddle. Stay here. He crouched low and examined the dirt. Emily watched him carefully. The cowboy brushed aside loose dust with his fingers, revealing marks pressed deep into the road. Boot prints, horse tracks, broken glass. An empty bottle lay half buried in the dirt nearby. Daniel picked it up and turned it slowly in his hand. Camp, he said. From the men yesterday? Maybe. He stood again and scanned the ridge above them. Emily felt fear creep back into her chest. They're close? Daniel didn't answer right away. Then he nodded once. Close enough. A sudden crack split the air. Gunfire echoed off the rocks. Daniel moved instantly. He grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her down behind the horse just as another shot struck the ground where they had been standing. Stay low, he ordered. More shots rang out from the ridge above them. Emily pressed herself against the horse's side, her heart pounding wildly. Daniel stepped away from the horse and raised his revolver. He fired once toward the rocks. The shot echoed across the hills. Another bullet slammed into the dirt nearby, spraying dust across Emily's dress. She forced herself to breathe slowly. Daniel moved calmly despite the chaos. He fired again. A shout came from the ridge. One of the attackers stumbled into view for a brief second before disappearing behind the rocks. The gunfire slowed, then stopped. For a long moment, the prairie was silent again. Daniel waited. He did not rush forward. He simply watched the ridge. Finally, he spoke. They're running. Emily slowly stood up from behind the horse. Her legs trembled but held. You scared them off? Daniel reloaded his revolver. No. He glanced at the ridge. They realized we're not easy prey. The truth of those words settled over her. Yesterday she had been tied helpless to a wagon wheel. Today she stood beside someone who refused to let fear decide the ending. Daniel climbed back into the saddle and helped her up again behind him. They rode the rest of the afternoon without another attack. As the sun lowered toward the western hills, a cluster of wooden buildings appeared in the distance. A small frontier town. Smoke rose from chimneys. Lanterns flickered along the dirt street. Daniel guided the horse toward the first building at the edge of town. Red Creek, he said. Emily looked around as they entered the quiet street. People turned to stare. News traveled fast in places like this. Men who hurt women rarely lost. But today they had. Daniel stopped the horse near the center of town. Emily climbed down slowly. For the first time in 2 days, solid ground beneath her feet felt safe. Daniel tipped his hat slightly. Sheriff's office is down that way, he said, pointing toward a building with a wooden star hanging above the door. Emily looked at him. You're leaving? That was always the plan. She hesitated. Then she stepped closer. Thank you, she said quietly. Not just for yesterday. Daniel's expression softened slightly. You already thanked me. Emily shook her head. No, she said. Yesterday, you saved my life. She met his eyes. Today, you reminded me that evil only wins when good people look away. For the first time since she met him, a faint smile touched Daniel Hayes's face. He tipped his hat again. Then he turned his horse back toward the open road. Daniel Hayes had almost reached the edge of town when he heard the shouting. Red Creek was the kind of place where noise usually meant trouble. The main street was small and quiet, with only a few wooden buildings standing against the dusty road. But now voices rose from behind him, sharp and angry. Daniel slowed his horse. He turned in the saddle and looked back toward the center of town. A crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Men stood in the street, talking loudly. One of them pointed toward the jailhouse, while another waved his arms in frustration. Daniel studied the scene carefully. Then he sighed and turned the horse around. Some roads had a way of pulling a man back, even when he tried to leave them behind. By the time he reached the sheriff's office, Emily Carter stood near the doorway, speaking to a large man wearing a faded sheriff's badge. The sheriff's hat sat low on his head, and his thick gray mustache twitched each time someone in the crowd spoke too loudly. The moment Emily saw Daniel riding back, relief crossed her face. Daniel dismounted slowly. "What's going on?" he asked. The sheriff looked at him. "You the one who brought her in?" Daniel nodded. The sheriff spat into the dust. "Name's Sheriff Dalton." He gestured toward the crowd. "Those men she told me about didn't disappear like we hoped." Emily stepped closer. "They came here?" "Not yet," Dalton said. "But we've got word from a rancher 2 miles west. 4 riders were seen heading toward town." Daniel frowned slightly. "There were 3 yesterday." Dalton nodded. "Looks like they found a friend." The people gathered outside the office shifted nervously. Red Creek was not a large town, and most of its people were farmers or shop owners. They were not ready for a gunfight. Emily glanced toward the road leading out of town. "They're coming for me." The words hung heavy in the evening air. Daniel rested a hand on the saddle horn of his horse. "Maybe," he said calmly. The sheriff folded his arms. "Or maybe they're coming for revenge." A distant sound rolled across the prairie. Hoofbeats. Several of them. Everyone in the street turned at the same time. 4 riders appeared on the far end of the road. They rode slowly, spreading across the width of the street like men who wanted to make sure everyone could see them. Emily's breath caught. One of the riders was the man who had run from the wagon the day before. His face twisted with anger the moment he spotted her standing beside Daniel. "That's him," Emily whispered. "The one who ran." The riders stopped about 30 yards away. One of them stepped forward. He was bigger than the others, with dark hair and a thick beard covering most of his face. His hand rested on the revolver at his belt. "Well now," he called loudly, "looks like our little problem found protection." The man who had run from the wagon pointed directly at Daniel. "That's the one who shot Tom." The bearded man looked Daniel over slowly. "You kill one of mine yesterday?" Daniel did not move. "Yes." The man nodded once. "Then I suppose you owe me." The town grew silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward. "This is Red Creek," he said loudly. "You boys best turn around before things get worse." The bearded outlaw smiled. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "you don't have enough men in this town to stop us." His eyes moved to Emily. "We're taking the girl." Daniel's voice broke the silence. "No." It was a simple word, but it carried the weight of a promise. The outlaw leader laughed. "You planning to stop us alone, cowboy?" Daniel slowly stepped away from his horse. He adjusted the brim of his hat. "I've done worse." For a long moment, neither side moved. Then, Everything exploded at once. The outlaws reached for their guns. Daniel moved faster. His revolver cleared leather in a single smooth motion. The first shot echoed through the street. The man who had run from the wagon screamed as the bullet knocked his gun from his hand. Sheriff Dalton fired next. His shotgun roared, blasting the hat off one of the riders and sending the man scrambling behind his horse. Gunfire cracked across the street. People dove for cover behind wagons and buildings. Emily pressed herself against the sheriff's office wall as the fight erupted. Daniel fired again. One outlaw's revolver spun from his hand, clattering across the dirt. The remaining riders tried to regroup, but the fight was already slipping away from them. They had expected fear. Instead, they found resistance. The bearded leader aimed directly at Daniel. 2 shots rang out at the same time. The outlaw's bullet struck the dirt near Daniel's boot. Daniel's shot tore through the man's shoulder. The outlaw cried out and dropped his gun. The remaining men looked around quickly. Their advantage was gone. The town was no longer afraid. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward with his shotgun raised. "Drop the weapons," he growled. For a moment it looked like the outlaws might keep fighting. Then one of them slowly lifted his hands. Another followed. Within seconds, the fight was over. The street fell quiet again. Dust drifted slowly through the fading sunlight. Sheriff Dalton and 2 other townsmen quickly tied the wounded outlaws and dragged them toward the jailhouse. The bearded leader glared at Daniel as they pulled him past. "This ain't over," he muttered. Daniel met his gaze calmly. "For you," he said quietly, "it is." The jailhouse door slammed shut. The crowd slowly began to relax. Some of the townspeople stepped forward, staring at Daniel with new respect. Sheriff Dalton walked back into the street, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Well," he said, "that's the most excitement Red Creek's had in 10 years. He looked at Daniel. "You ever thought about wearing a badge?" Daniel shook his head. "No." Dalton laughed softly. "Didn't think so." Emily stepped forward then. The fear that once filled her eyes had changed into something stronger. She looked at Daniel for a long moment. "You could stay," she said quietly. Daniel glanced toward the open prairie beyond the town. The road stretched long and empty beneath the setting sun. "That road's been my home a long time," he said. Emily nodded slowly. "I understand." She reached out and took his hand briefly. "Then thank you again." Daniel tipped his hat. "You don't need saving anymore," he said. "You proved that yourself." The sky burned orange as the sun dipped behind the distant hills. Daniel climbed back onto his horse. The people of Red Creek watched as he turned toward the road. Emily stood quietly in the street. For a moment, their eyes met one last time. Then, Daniel Hayes rode out of town. The prairie swallowed him slowly as the evening shadows stretched across the land. Emily watched until he disappeared beyond the hills. The fear that once controlled her life was gone. In its place was something stronger. Hope. Because sometimes it only takes one brave soul to remind the world that courage still rides these dusty roads.